Now, let's read the passage at the heart of this controversy. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he ate with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And with him the rest of the Jews acted insincerely, so that even Barnabas was carried away by their insincerity. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, quote, If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? End of quote. A plain, intuitive reading of the passage seems to indicate a real public confrontation between Peter and Paul, the two most glorious apostles, to use a phrase from Irenaeus. But based on the text, it's a confrontation over behavior or praxis, not doctrinal teaching or orthodoxy. On the face of it, Paul apparently publicly accuses Peter of scandal, insincerity, and/or hypocrisy, not heresy or doctrinal error. Now, some have suggested that the refusal to eat with Gentiles refers to the Eucharistic liturgy, which would make the sin and scandal of Peter even more grave. However, it is not necessary to interpret it that way, since I'm not aware of any church father who interprets it that way. In Acts 10:28 and Jubilees 22:16 provide sufficient reason to assume Paul is referring to ordinary meals and not the Eucharist. Lastly, it's important to point out that we only hear Paul's side of the story or recounting of the event. We never hear Peter's side of the story, or any context he might provide that might be relevant or significant to evaluating Peter's actions or inactions, and thus whether Paul's rebuke was fully justified or accurate. Thomas Aquinas seems to follow the opinion of Augustine that Paul did indeed rightly accuse Peter of sin and scandal. By scandal, of course, we mean here leading others into sin and/or error by one's action or inaction. It can be a grave sin if caused by those in an office of authority, which would include an apostle, pope, bishop, priest, or deacon. Before we analyze the Galatians 2 confrontation further, I want to point out an interesting and provocative theory that this confrontation, or perhaps the letter to the Galatians itself, unintentionally caused an empire-wide church schism that provoked, at least in part, the writing of the Gospels and the book of Acts, which were intended to help heal the schism and reestablish unity. This theory is argued for in the recent book written by Father Kappas and William Albrecht, which I've read and which directs the reader to another book by Jack Gibson, published in 2013, that is dedicated entirely to this theory, apparently. While I think the theory is plausible and intriguing, I still find it fairly tenuous and in need of more direct and substantial evidence. But I thought it was worth mentioning for those who wanted to explore the topic further. Just to clarify, the theory is not that Peter and Paul actually ever broke communion with each other, but that various other factions used the temporary tension and conflict, or Paul's letter to the Galatians, to cause division that Peter and Paul never intended or desired. In evaluating the relative credibility, culpability, authority, whatever you want to call it, between Peter and Paul, I do think it is important to scrutinize Paul too and to ask, did Paul follow Jesus's Matthew 18:15 command regarding sin and scandal? Paul says he confronted Peter to his face and in front of everyone. Yet Jesus tells us to handle such situations differently. In Matthew 18:15, Jesus tells us, if your brother sins, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. And if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. Now, Paul doesn't tell us whether he tried to talk with Peter one-on-one about his concerns or not, or if he tried to do so with a smaller group of witnesses. Should we assume Paul tried to do this? I'm not so sure that we should. But Jerome apparently believed that Paul was aware of Christ's words about rebuking a brother privately first, and that Paul would never have violated this commandment. He says, so how could Paul venture to rebuke publicly the greatest of the apostles so resolutely and firmly, unless Peter had consented beforehand to this? Paul accordingly would not have insulted the man whose praises he had sung in many instances. And he goes on to quote some prior passages of Galatians. Here we also get a glimpse of what Jerome believed happened, at least at one point in his life. He goes into more detail in his letter 126 to Augustine, which we will also look at. Besides the question of whether Paul had tried to speak privately with Peter first, there is also the question of hypocrisy on Paul's part. We read at the beginning of chapter 16 in Acts, right after the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, a disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews that were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Similar to Peter's fear, it appears that Paul himself was afraid of the Jews in that region and circumcised Timothy for that reason. Now, this is very strange. The Council of Jerusalem says circumcision is no longer necessary. Then Paul circumcises Timothy anyway. And then the two of them deliver the council's binding rulings that circumcision is no longer binding. And yet Titus was not compelled to be circumcised, as Paul admits in his letter to the Galatians. So how do we make sense of all this? Well, at best, one might speculate that Timothy was willing or eager to suffer circumcision for the sake of a more receptive audience among the Jews. But that would be quite the sacrifice. There was a very natural reason many Greeks and Romans, called God-fearers, only practiced Judaism up to a point, with circumcision being a huge, painful obstacle and line in the sand. Moreover, it still seems Timothy's post-council circumcision would undermine the very decision of the council that said circumcision is unnecessary. If you haven't already, check out my video on Timothy and Titus, where I demonstrate the source and nature of their post-apostolic authority from Paul's letters to them. I then bring in what the earliest church fathers had to say about apostolic succession and the authority of bishops, as well as some relevant commentary on the letters to Timothy and Titus by John Chrysostom. One interesting, though speculative theory from Tertullian is that Paul was a trembling and overeager or overzealous neophyte in his zeal against Judaism, and that was the reason Paul thought there was something to be blamed in the conduct of Peter and the other apostles. And so Tertullian points out that Paul's accusation or censure was, quote, directed against conduct destined to become acceptable even to their accuser, namely Paul. So Tertullian is perhaps the earliest church writer to see this inconsistency. I don't know that I would go so far as to call Paul an overzealous neophyte or trembling, but it's interesting nonetheless. Notably, this passage ends saying that Peter and Paul were in perfect concord with regard to their public doctrine. Again, Tertullian seems to be the earliest commentator on this controversy and confrontation recorded in Galatians 2. And he too points out the apparent inconsistency in Paul rebuking Peter with specific reference to Paul's circumcision of Timothy. Tertullian defends Peter by pointing out that Paul himself says that he made himself all things to all men, making himself a Jew to the Jews. Tertullian goes on to say something quite interesting, saying, therefore, it was according to times and persons and causes that they used to censure certain practices, which they would not hesitate themselves to pursue, in like conformity to times and persons and causes. Just, for example, as if Peter too had censured Paul because, while forbidding circumcision, he actually circumcised Timothy himself. What is Tertullian saying here? Apparently, he was saying that the apostles would approve or condemn certain practices, including concessions to the old law, depending upon the specific circumstances or situation, rather than as a matter of principle. He ends this passage saying, we should ignore those who try to sit in judgment over the apostles. Origen also seems to see inconsistency or hypocrisy, or at least awkwardness, in criticizing Peter and those who, quote, withdrew and separated themselves from the heathen, when even Paul himself became a Jew to the Jews that he might gain the Jews. Origen points out that the Acts of the Apostles tells us Paul brought a Jewish offering to the altar to try to satisfy the Jews that he was no apostate from their law. This inconsistency, or apparent inconsistency in Paul, was noticed and pointed out by Jerome too. Jerome says, O Paul, why are you, notwithstanding your own doctrine, compelled to circumcise Timothy, the son of a Gentile, nay, more a Gentile himself? If then you forgive yourself the circumcision of a disciple coming from the Gentiles, forgive Peter also, who has precedence above you, his doing some things of the same kind through fear of the believing Jews. Again, it raises the question of hypocrisy on Paul's part, or whether something else is going on. And to save face for Paul, Jerome believes that something else is going on, as we've already gotten hints of, and we'll hear more of later. But again, if we are going to make excuses for Paul on the basis of evangelization and prudence, then why shouldn't or why couldn't we do the same for Peter? Again, We never hear Peter's side of the story or any context he might provide that might be relevant and significant to evaluating Peter's actions or inactions, and thus whether Paul's rebuke was fully justified. Was Peter's avoidance of the Gentile Christians in Antioch meant to be temporary? Was there something of a moral nature about the known beliefs and practices of those particular Gentile Christians that Peter knew would have scandalized Jewish believers? Or was Peter cautious because he didn't know these Gentile Christians very well? Where the confrontation fits into the chronology of other events is uncertain, which also complicates the interpretation. But we do know both Peter and Paul spent significant time at Antioch at one point. My point is that even though the letter to Galatians is inspired scripture, I think it is at least still possible that Paul was mistaken, not as a matter of teaching or principle, but as a matter of fact or prudence, perhaps. Timothy's circumcision is not the only inconsistency and keeping of the law by Paul that Jerome notices and points out to Augustine. If you read Acts chapter 21, verses 17 through 26, well after the Council of Jerusalem, we read about Paul shaving his head, walking barefoot, offering sacrifices at the temple, along with other Christian men. Moreover, Paul did all these things at the urging of James and the Jerusalem elders. Again, the reason for all this was apparently to avoid giving offense to the Jews, though it doesn't even work if one reads on in the same chapter, where the Jews get Paul arrested. Perhaps the best one can say in Paul's favor is that Peter's concessions to the old law came at the expense of the Gentile Christians, deprived of fellowship with Peter, at least temporarily, whereas Paul's concessions came only at his own expense, or the expense of those willing to take on those burdens for the sake of the gospel.